Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined by Matt and Arco and Mathoma to do an AAR on the Dave and Kristi debate of last week. Some of the broad points that I want to lay out before we begin to dissect the debate are one, I think, and I think Matt would agree with me as well, that the terms of the debate were not quite as broad. Obviously, they were not as broad as the Sargon's term of the debate, but they were still a good deal too broad. And that'll lead to some problems later on in the debate that we can point out. But I think the other thing is with the beginning of the debate, before even the pre-debate, well, I think we all sort of knew that Kristi wasn't really going to deal with the data directly. And Dave did a solid job of laying out the data of the from a consequentialist point of view that feminism and the second wave feminism and the sexual revolution have been overall deleterious to our society as a whole. But one of the things in the prep phase before the debate is that I don't think Dave thought about the fact is, what if Kristi's going to go deontological and she'll ignore consequences? It's right because it's right, no matter what the consequences are. And I think that becomes important as well as we look into the debate. But jumping into the debate, in the beginning, Dave goes first, so Dave gave the opening statement. Lots of factual evidence, and I think this was clearly trying to avoid a repeat of Sargon, because with Sargon of Akkad, he didn't have any statistical data, so Kristi Winters could just kind of dance around that fact and back Sargon into a corner. So in that sense, Dave, in the beginning, prevented that from happening. So that was one less problem for Dave to deal with on his plate. Kristi's opening response was typical, deflection, diversion, bring up the stuff from the Bible and laws from the Victorian age. But something interesting about Kristi's opening statement, as well as Dave's, is that the terms of the debate itself were too broad. It was something to the effect of, was second wave feminism's efforts in aiding the sexual revolution good for American society as a whole? Now, of course, what is good? And this was typical because it's predictable. Dave, being more of a traditionalist, is going to see good as some sort of, rooted in the Bible, rooted in Aristotelian philosophy and common sense. Kristi Winters, being an atheist and a liberal, is going to view the good in a radically different way. And so even if everything Dave said were true from the perspective of a humanist, feminist, liberal atheist, that doesn't matter because those values are a priori bad. And so right from the get-go, we have a problem that's never really solved throughout the debate. I think you have something to say on that, Matt.
Yeah, that was basically a good summary. Kristi opened up basically by saying that there are three pillars to her argument. Equality, equality of treatment specifically was what she said. Autonomy, and the third one being fairness. Fairness, all three. And she counted that distinct from the other two because she was trying to make a broader point that she never followed up on. And her inability to capitalize on following up that point is what kind of kept Dave in the debate. I don't think he was prepared to answer the deontological point she could have gone down with fairness, that being the basic idea of, okay, suppose everything you're saying is, true, Dave. If the second wave feminism's liberalization of women in their sexual roles in marriage and society is what is bringing the whole thing down, then could it be argued from a duty perspective that, too much of society is held on the backs of women behaving themselves? And is that not right? So she could have really got him there. And his insistence on defining the sexual revolution purely in terms of its, consequences, while she defined it in terms of a mechanism of social change defined by changing social attitudes, that those difference in definitions really caused the divide and allowed her to gain this metaphysical ground that he never was able to come at her on. So I guess that's my short take on it for now.
Yeah, if Dave wanted to have a debate purely about statistics and consequences, having a tighter debate definition would have gone a long way in helping out with that. Mathoma, what are your impressions on the opening statements of Dave and Kristi?
I'm not sure if I have too much to add to what you guys just said. I think certainly Dave had the more statistical and numerical approach, whereas Kristi basically, right in her, I think the first or second statement, she had to essentially redefine what she meant by good, as opposed to the consequentialist attitude that Dave had. He was citing distinct outcomes such as cognitive effects on children, increased drug use, declining female happiness, whereas Kristi goes immediately to define the good as we were saying, equal treatment, bodily autonomy. So in that sense, she kind of, I mean, she takes an interesting turn in debate just from her first or second statement.
Yeah. And Narco, do you have any thoughts on the opening statements?
Yeah, I'll say a little bit in defense of, I guess for the premise, I'll say that while I agree it could have been stronger, it's kind of a double-edged sword to these kinds of things, because you have to think about what Kristi Winters would actually be willing to debate live in front of an audience. So, but that's not really a defense of the premise, that's just the defense for being pragmatic in terms of being able to debate people. I will say on how Winters could basically alter the definition of good, if she were to bring it to ethical concerns, especially considering bodily autonomy and women's liberation, at that point, once it becomes a battle of ethics, I would think she would actually put herself up. I think that would be a little bit of her Achilles heel, especially given her liberalism and atheism, which is certainly seeped in subjective ethics, and I'm sure Winters is probably a believer in subjective morality as well. That actually would be far more vulnerable for her, because if she, on what solid ground could she take to defend ethical positions that she agrees in and of itself?
Yeah.
I'm not saying she. Yeah. Never mind then.
But yeah, it seems that, well, like I had said earlier, there's two things you could have done to tighten up the idea of the good. Either have a more specifically defined premise, or if you want to keep the premise as is, Dave and Kristi should have got together beforehand and more or less described what they each thought the good meant. So that discussion would not have taken place in the debate, but would have taken place prior to the debate as part of the preparation work. So that I think was basically, they should have front loaded that, so that didn't show up in the debate, so we could stick to the actual arguments. Now, in the rebuttal, now one of the things that Dave did in his rebuttal statement was, on the one hand, he pointed out correctly that Kristi, some of her points, well, pretty much all of her points were irrelevant to what the data he brought up. Now, he didn't say all of her points, he said some of her points, because he then goes on to challenge some of her claims. But I think the mistake was in attempting to challenge any of them, because what a person like Kristi's going to want to do, she's going to want to throw all this stuff out there that's not directly related to the debate, and hoping that you'll try to argue against one or two of those. You don't have to argue against all of them. A smart opponent won't, but someone like Kristi is hoping that you'll at least take one of them. And really, if that's the opening statement Kristi gives, there's not much you could say, because none of it's actually relevant to the consequentialist attempt that Dave is getting at. The only thing that Dave really should have responded to but didn't was her sort of definition of the good. Is what is the good, and then the issues of the definition of the sexual revolution, but with fairness and such. He didn't hit that as much as hard as I think he should have, because most everything else she said was just irrelevant. Do you have any thoughts on that, Matt?
I'm sorry, I missed the very tail end of what you said. Can you run that by me again real quick?
No, sure. I was just going to say that the only thing that Dave really should have responded to in Kristi's opening statement was that her definition of the good, and tried to deal with the fairness issue she brings up, which, as you pointed out, I think earlier, maybe not yet, that he didn't really ever grapple with completely.
Right. Yeah, that's basically my position on it. As far as Dave's rebuttal, I thought it was pretty good. I liked how he handled the autonomy issue. Now, you know that she brought it up again in the closing, but I mean, it's easy to bring it up in the closing when your opponent can't, deal with it again. But, his idea of if people use their autonomy to shoot up drugs or something in the community, well, nobody can argue that they're not exercising their autonomy, but we can still lament the social degradation that's going on there. Nobody bats an eye. And so, when nobody feels like we have perfect claim to physical autonomy. I thought that was really, really good. Economists sometimes discuss this in terms of, say, like the paradox of thrift or other contexts. So this is actually a tactic that's really well done, and I think that's going to be a good argument going forward. But again, in his rebuttal, he talks about, well, no. Here's what really struck me as rebuttal. It's when he talked about how Kristi's statements about the sexual revolution in terms of laws and everything else. He said those just quote unquote naturally occur over the flow of time. Our laws just naturally get better. We just naturally get more information. Everything naturally happens, which, in my view, begs the question. And I'm really concerned about, not concerned, but surprised Kristi didn't call him out on that. Do they really naturally occur? Do we just randomly just pull laws out of a hat, or are there specific ideological or academic strains of thought that lead to people having different ideas, which get codified into legal theory? How do these changes get made? And I think Kristi could have pushed him a lot harder on that point than she did. That was a missed opportunity for her. But I guess that was my overall thoughts on the rebuttal.
Now, in Dave's rebuttal, didn't he bring up the black family and high illegitimacy rates? Because I think you want to say something about that too.
Oh yeah, that's another good point. Yeah, I didn't want to take too long talking, but yeah, he brought that up a couple of times in the discussion, and that's very, very risky for him to do. Not necessarily because he's wrong on the issue, but here's the thing. If you're past the opening statement, if the debate isn't centered or purely around the black family and all of the sociological statistical effects that are going along with that, where you can dedicate a whole lot of time, it's dangerous to just kind of throw that out there, because setting the context, I felt like Dave was already on the defensive going into his rebuttal. A, because Kristi was able to paint his definition of the sexual revolution as tactical. Don't know if she did that sooner or later, but she did it eventually, and she was bound to do it. B, she questioned the statistics, and so he had to really go into defense on several fronts. And what he needed to do to defend his statistics was paint a picture for the audience, like paint how sharp the decline was before the mild increase that Kristi was talking about. Paint a regression picture, show a graph, show something, so that the audience will know about the stats what he does, right? He assumed the audience was kind of as familiar with him on the stats as he was, and maybe that's not true. So they kind of had to take the word for it. But instead of what he did is he talked about the black family as a specific example of the statistics. And when he's already on the defensive, and then all Kristi has to do in response to that is be like, well, what about the war on drugs? What about gentrification? What about X, Y, and Z? She doesn't have to spend a whole lot of time going into detail on these points. All she has to do is cast a legitimate doubt on his line of reasoning, and one of two things is going to happen. Either A, he has to spend so much time going after and defending that point that he's not going to be able to answer her the questions in the time allowed, or B, he's just going to be unable to answer it because he just doesn't have the stats prepared and how to control for all those different variables. It's going to make him look very reductionist. I mean, there's no way he comes out of that ahead. So that was something that struck me as kind of reckless personally.
Yeah, I just good thing Kristi wasn't able to capitalize on it. So yeah, what are your thoughts, Mathoma, on Dave's rebuttal?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I had anything to add to the last statement. I mean, certainly, I think the point he brought up about bodily autonomy not being the whole story here, with his example of someone shooting up heroin, how this obviously affects other people. I think that was a pretty good point on how autonomy can't be the only thing to consider here if the sexual revolution is good for society. And I think later on in the debate, I think Winters actually did cast doubt on that point about the effects of the sexual revolution upon black families. She did say precisely that. She casted doubt upon the stat by saying, oh, what about the drug war? What about black incarceration, differences between whites and blacks? But yeah, I don't think I had too much to add to Dave's rebuttal.
All right. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Enrico?
I'd say probably one of the stronger parts is when she asked Dave why does it matter about that fact that people are having, it was related to children. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble remembering the point, but I think
I remember the point. The point was, if we don't choose to have kids, why does broken child households matter?
Exactly. And I think his response to that, very, very straightforward, very direct. We are all children. So I would say that was probably the strongest parts of the rebuttal.
Yeah, one thing, this might be in Dave's rebuttal, or it might be a bit later. One thing that I'm surprised he didn't press harder was Kristi wanted to argue, her key point was that these sexual preferences undulate through time. And Dave wanted to make the argument that there was a sharp break and change of degree in the 1960s. Now, my first watch through, I didn't think she brought up any points earlier than 1960, but she actually did. At a couple points throughout the debate, she mentioned the 20s. But what's interesting though is she never actually used statistical data from the 20s or 30s or 40s, or any article talking about the 20s, 30s, or 40s. And she only would cite statistical data after like 1975. So I'm really surprised that throughout the debate, Dave never actually called her out on that and said, well, if you're going to argue that there's this undulating view of sexual preferences, what is the statistical data you have for the 1920s, 30s, and 40s that, which if he'd done that, I mean, he would have nailed her, because I don't think she would have had that data. So, yeah, Snake, I see you're here. Do you have anything you want to add to the discussion about Dave's rebuttal?
Yeah, sure. I gotta say, I was kind of disappointed in Dave's rebuttal that, you know, Kristi Winters, her response, or not her response, but her opening statement was filled with all kinds of stuff that you could have picked apart. I mean, she was talking mostly about, you know, what she perceived as being, you know, anti-feminist ideas in the Bible and all this stuff that had nothing to do with the topic whatsoever. And he kind of just let that slide. I felt like it would have been easy to take, you know, to take a bomb to half of the statements she had made. And I don't know. I felt like he left a lot of it intact and just kind of sort of played her game when he shouldn't have had to. That was my take on it.
Yeah, I think when somebody brings up irrelevant claims to the actual proposition under debate, the best response is just to argue that as William Lane Craig will often do. For instance, when Hitchens went on and on about how God was mean, the God of the Bible, Craig would always answer, well, even if all those things are true, because you usually debate the existence of God, he would always end up saying, well, even if those things are all true, how does that prove that God does not exist? And so to sort of like paraphrase Craig, what Dave could have or should have said is, even if all you said is true, Kristi, about the Bible and Victorian legal systems, how does that prove that the sexual revolution has not exacerbated these issues? That would be, I think, the correct response to those kinds of baseless claims that would take far too long to.
It struck me as a straw man. Like, here is one cherry-picked example from the Bible that sounds like it's bad for women. Therefore, I'm right. You know, it has nothing to do with. I don't know. It just seemed like a really dirty tactic, and Dave kind of let it slide, in my opinion.
Well, the other thing that's interesting is with the using the Bible and those other values, this really gets to the nub of the difference of values and of good. If you believe in, you know, the Bible or some sort of Aristotelian conception of the good, then you're going to have more of you're going to have a deontological / virtue ethics kind of attitude going on, whereas the left tends to be consequentialist in certain respects, but also deontological in other respects. Usually whenever it suits their purposes, it seems to be. But basically, the things that are bad that Dave is talking about would not be seen as bad from somebody that rejects biblical and classical moral foundations. If they believe in, you know, atheism, individualism, socialism, anarchism, whatever, they would see those as good. So given that we would have expected Kristi to take this moral stance that she did, the consequentialism almost doesn't work, because they can concede all those points and just say, yeah, but those aren't bad.
Yeah, I think maybe Dave really had to press her. Another thing in her opening statement was she was basically defining good as feminism. So yes, in that context, yes, feminism was good because feminism was feminism. So I think if you don't engage her on that, like, why is that good? You know, that if you don't engage her definition at the beginning, then you're kind of fighting a losing battle.
Yeah. Now, when we get to the cross-examination, which lasts 20 minutes, that was, I think, could have been handled a little bit better. The cross-examination seemed to be too all over the place. Like when you and when Mathoma and Snake, you two debated, we had a much more structured cross-examination that I feel like was more fruitful for drawing out questions from the other side. But one of the things that Kristi does, very, given her statistical background, was to get Dave bogged down in the statistics. And she says, well, what are the statistics you have for these increased rates of illegitimacy and delinquency and yada, yada, yada. And she was zeroing in on the key issue for her to prove that, and then to then win the debate, is she wanted Dave to look up and show that men were committing these delinquent activities post-sexual revolution with a higher frequency than women. And when she got him to look into that, and then he gave her the numbers, then men did it like 3 or 4 times greater than women did. And this is where I think Kristi decisively won the debate, because Dave says, yes, Kristi, you were right. I agree with you. Men are the problem. Now, while we can all understand that there are pathologies of male sexuality, that was neither the time nor the place to openly say that, because you're talking to a feminist who has a feminist audience watching. And when you say that you agree with Kristi, they can then say, and I think Kristi sort of moved in this direction, what are we even debating about if we agree? So I know you have some strong thoughts about that, Snake, so how about you go first?
Some strong thoughts about what specifically, just so.
Dave's response to Kristi's tactic.
Oh, are we referring to when he perhaps got a little animated halfway through?
Well, when he said that, Kristi, you're right. It's
Yes.
men that are the problem. Yeah.
Right, and I think it could be argued, giving him the benefit of the doubt, that maybe some of these traditional gender roles were in place in part to kind of limit the options of men so that it would be productive to society. So from that standpoint, yes, you could say that men are part of, I really want to phrase this carefully, are part of the problem, but the way he articulated it was just, yeah, like you said, saying, you're right, men are the problem. It just sounded really bad, and it sounded like he was just conceding the entire feminist worldview. And I mean, I could just see, MGTOW people going insane hearing that, to put it that way.
Yeah. Matt, what are your thoughts on that move there?
Well, I actually missed this from the intro. At the very, very end of Dave's intro, he basically came flat out and said from the beginning, we and feminism need to cooperate to find solutions to these problems. So whereas Sargon was given the very, very broad task of trying to show that feminism as an institution at this point is bad for society, Dave was able to basically just concede the point entirely and just say, no, feminism's fine. As it is, we'll work with it and, just figure things out. Well, given that that's the narrative he went with, he kind of had no choice but to keep following through with it. Now, on the statistic in question about, sexual promiscuity as far as men versus women, 2 things about that. First, she had him chasing the numbers when he really didn't pounce on a single point that she made that he really could have punished her with. And that was when she said, well, but these stats are for 18 plus, and if they're grown-ups, what does it matter? Right? He completely, I feel, just did not address that as quickly or as he needed to. The second thing was the numbers, right? When you're talking about sexual promiscuity of men versus women and partners and all that stuff. I mean, just mathematically speaking, you could admit to a number as being right and say, so what? If one man, for example, has sex with 7 women, the man isn't going to get pregnant 7 times and, cause any maybe social issues that could result from that. But you could say in 4 of those sexual encounters, or 7 of those sexual encounters, get 4 women pregnant, and 2 women might decide to keep the pregnancy, views about abortion on the side, let's address culture the way it is. Two women maybe could keep the pregnancy, and either he's going to have to live with both women and help them raise their children equally, or one of them's going to go without, or both are going to go without. And so you're going to have, social on the state. You're going to have all the problems that Dave brought up statistically speaking and all that stuff. So even just looking at the mathematics there, it doesn't matter that women only had 2 more partners and men exploded, because women only need to have sex the once to get the pregnant, for example. So it doesn't matter in that aspect.
Yeah. Mathoma, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I think this was the point in the debate where I got a little frustrated myself. I think Dave also got a little frustrated because Winters was sandbagging on the stats there. She was also focusing in on one particular interval, which was like in the last 20 years, whereas the topic of the debate is much more a long-term issue. And Winters was sandbagging there, trying to focus in on one particular interval. And with regards to what you guys were saying in terms of sort of conceding the topic of the debate, it seems that Winters actually conceded it quite a bit at that point, didn't she? Because she seemed to say that we have a problem here with increased number of sexual partners. And then she adds on the point, and it's men's fault. But in terms of the topic of the debate, doesn't she concede something there?
Oh, you mean in the sense that saying that these behavior are problems? I suppose yes and no. In one sense, as she says later on, these pathologies could be solved if we had a more robust welfare state, if men did more work at the home. So these pathologies are not the result, quote unquote, on her point of view, from these liberalized views on sex. From her point of view, it's attributed to men not taking up the slack. So I'm not sure that's necessarily a concession. But Anarcho, do you have anything to say about this period of the debate?
No, not particularly.
I think when it comes to Kristi sandbagging, you brought up a good point, Mathoma. I mean, really, it wasn't any one decade or any 2 decades. It was really looking at a period, really 80 plus years. Going back to norms prior to, well, actually 100 years, really, because the suffragette movement in the United States really gets going in the 20s. So, and for Kristi's point of view, the definition of changing views of sexuality is a, that's what she's going with. So that feminists, the suffragettes in the late 19 teens and early 20s is a part of that. And so it really is about a 100-year period we're looking at. And I think the proper response for Dave to do was, since any one decade isn't really going to be important, is just to respond that this question is it's either irrelevant, or if it is relevant, it's imprecisely argued. He could have said, well, that's just too short of a time. From a statistical point of view, he could have said that's too short of a time span to be useful to make the points, given the length of time it took for these changes to occur. But going right into it was just, it was not the proper response. It was because see, Kristi was not going there to argue over the statistical data. So the more you grapple with her on these deflections, the more she can kind of appear to be controlling the narrative of the debate. Whereas if she asks questions that are irrelevant, you say that you don't just say they are, you explain why as well. You don't want to just say, well, I'm not going to answer because it's irrelevant. People might think you're grandstanding unless you can explain why.
I don't know, because later in the debates, they got a weird question from the audience about, I think it was gay marriage or something like that. I would just outright say that has nothing to do with this debate, and I wouldn't even go there.
Well, yeah, in that case, you're right. But I'm glad you brought up the gay marriage thing, because there's another thing. This is in the Q&A, not Q&A, the cross-examination. And this is a classic tactic of feminists, and it was sad to see Dave walk into it. She said to Dave, in your ideal society, what would female sexuality look like? What the nature of female sexuality would look like in Dave's hypothetical society is totally irrelevant to the proposition at hand. And in attempting to answer it in any way, it doesn't really matter, because on the one hand, if he could take a libertarian view, which is more of what he did, more of a libertarianish view. But even attempting to answer it, it's going to fall short of the progressive gold standard, quote unquote. And in so doing, she can then leverage that and say, you're sexist.
He also doesn't have to. He doesn't have to. Yeah.
That's the key thing. He doesn't have to. So Again, as an example, William Lane Craig in his debates with Hitchens. When Hitchens throws up all this FUD, notice William Lane Craig has a laser-like focus on the proposition at hand. Anything that is irrelevant, Craig will say, well, that is irrelevant. It has nothing to do with the debate, and so there's no need to answer it. Now, when he has a rebuttal statement and there's nothing to rebut, what he'll usually do then is just say that, well, the other side has given no positive arguments for naturalism and no counter arguments to my arguments for supernaturalism. And that would be something that Dave could have done. He could have said, well, none of this directly deals with, was the second wave feminism supporting the changes in sexual attitudes in the sexual revolution good for America? He could have just said, like Craig would have said, well, those things are, even if true, not relevant to the actual point, and then just reiterated what the points are that were in favor of it. Matt, do you have any thoughts on that?
Nope, that about sums it up.
Mathoma, you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, with regards to some of the spurious questions from the audience, I think Dave tackled them pretty well. I mean, on that question about what are we going to do about homosexuality, I mean, he spent all of 10 seconds on that question, I think. I think he actually gave a good answer, that he would have to know specifically what policy we're dealing with here. I mean, so I don't think he really got derailed on any tangential questions. Well,
yeah, in the Q&A probably, but I think with Kristi, there was a couple ones he did, like the statistical, wild goose chase she set up. Narco, do you have any thoughts you want to add to this?
Yeah, I'm going to second the point Mathema just made, especially because I'm actually just going to say in general, I'm glad that the whole LGBTQ question was avoided throughout the debate, because that would basically just have been an ethical question that Dave really couldn't utilize stats to back up any point that he would have made. So it was, I agree with how he with Mathema, that how he dealt with that question, a very baseline, a very short answer was the right thing to do at that moment.
Yeah. One thing in the broader performance level that I feel was deleterious to Dave's attempt to win the debate was he really implicitly conceded a lot of the metaphysical assumptions of Kristi Winters' feminism. Like Matt mentioned in the beginning of the opening statement, he said that, we need to work with feminists, that toxic, in so many words, toxic masculinity was the problem. And things like that. Now, if you assume the opponent's metaphysical positions, there is one instance in which it is valid to do that, and it's to point out that if you assume these things, which we I know you assume, to point out that one of their stated goals conflicts with one of their assumed values. Now, and if you do it in that case, then assuming for the sake of argument your opponent's position can be quite constructive, because you force them to then come to grips with other beliefs that they have that contradict one of their core beliefs. But see, Dave never did that. He just kind of tacitly assumed a lot of these things out of hand and then just didn't challenge them, which has the appearance of conceding to Kristi. Now, I'm not necessarily saying Dave intended to concede to Kristi, but that's the appearance that he gave by just sort of accepting, yeah, okay, we'll accept that, we'll accept that, we'll accept that. If you are going to do that, what you should be doing is pointing out that those assumptions contradict some other assumptions that she has, that she considers to be core assumptions. And in that case, you can then point out that it's contradictory. So once she framed the debate in terms of ethics, metaphysics, and things like that, once Dave laid the foundation for the statistics, which were never really challenged after that, the next step, I think, logically would have been to pick apart the metaphysical assumptions by saying, well, okay, if you believe X, Y, and Z, well, that contradicts what you said over here, what you believe over here, and then force her to come to terms with the fact that her belief system doesn't hang together well. And first, Matt, I think you have something to say about that, and then Snake.
Okay. As far as the statistics go, there's an interesting phenomena I've been noticing that progressives are doing. I'm taking to calling the progressive two-step, just like the Hitchens two-step that people have pointed out to me. And what they'll do is they'll say, we have a social crisis going on here. Look at these statistics, unequal representation, or so-and-so incarceration rates, or so-and-so, and look at these very, very broad statistics. And then when you say, well, okay, we'll deal with your statistical claims about privilege, about, whatever you want to talk about. We'll argue in the realm of statistics. If they start losing that battle or get anything that's, bad on the narrative side, they'll then start retreating back to the individualist assumptions about, like Kristi was doing. And you could see this really, really well in the Google memo, where you're talking about, well, there's not enough representation of gender, privilege, blah, 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 blah. And the guy says, okay, let's talk about the statistics. Let's talk about personality traits. Let's talk about the tests. Let's talk about all these things and statistics. Progressives don't like it. And so now the narrative becomes, okay, the individual women at the company are now made to feel unworthy or unsafe by this discussion of the statistics. This is kind of what happened in the debate. Kristi had a feeling she might get cornered on the statistics, and so she retreated back to the individualist metaphysics, basically. And so that's really slimy. It's really, really hard to wrangle in such small, bite-sized, interactions. So I can't harp on Dave too much for that. I think he did the best he could. It's hard to tell exactly where they're going to come from. Yeah, exactly, like Arco said in the chat, Mott and Bailey. It's something they use all the time. So it's hard to know exactly where they're going to come from. And so I think Dave did all right with that. One place I do feel that Dave did really, really well in exactly what you want him to do in the assumptions is when he pointed out that child abuse, child rape, and all this stuff happened more often under single households and all of that stuff. So even if what she was saying is true and all this stuff was liberating for women, all these other things that she already pointed out as bads were happening more under these structural relationships anyway. I think that was kind of his attempt to do it. And I think that was a pretty strong rebuttal.
Oh, that was great. I just kind of wish you hit that some more. But kind of what I wanted to draw out of you, Matt, was your response to conceding the metaphysical terrain. You had some thoughts about that.
Oh, well, yeah, that's what I brought up earlier, especially about the idea of fairness. I think of the two pillars that Kristi brought up, like I said earlier, you had autonomy and you had equal treatment. I think we have some, or your position has some really good tools to deal with those. But now what's going to happen, which is, I guess, where I was going with the statistical two-step analogy before I got kind of sidetracked, is this. Once they lose the statistical ground, they start talking about autonomy and equality in the realm of statistics, they're going to have to retreat back to ethics. And so the central question that's going to come up in all of this is going to be, okay, women have to shoulder more responsibilities in society because apparently the liberalization of women is causing all these things to start tumbling down. So you're going to have to explain to women how it's mostly their job to keep things in check. That's how they're going to argue for it. And so I think that's what you're going to have to be prepared to argue in the future once the realm of statistics starts being given up more and more and more in the coming debate.
Yeah. Snake, I see that you wanted to make a point.
Well, yes, I think, someone mentioned Mott and Bailey. This was a classic example of it, and it's unfortunate that Dave didn't recognize that. Whenever you're dealing with these kind of progressive liberal types, you do see this trend where they will, they'll begin with this very palatable, oh, we just want each individual to pursue what they want. It sounds very reasonable. And then, oh crap, I'm starting to lose. Now I'm going to push forward into, other territories like, well, statistically, there weren't many women in this field. And it's very seamless unless you're really paying attention, you're critical of it. And I think what would have been a much stronger strategy from Dave's point of view, if he was trying to snap the audience out of their kind of just nodding their heads the whole time, he should have really exposed that. Like, he should have brought up, what do you value? Do you value freedom, or do you value kind of equality of outcome or something like that? And that would have forced her to take a stance that I think at least half of her audience would not have been pleased with to hear her say out loud. And one other thing was that, how would I put this? I guess what Dave really could have also pressed on is, I want to phrase this correctly, would be, I don't know. I guess that was my main point anyway.
Mathoma, did you have anything you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, I think it's on a much larger point. It's interesting that there's a question which undergirds this entire debate, and it came up at a few points, which is it would have to be a whole separate discussion. It would have to be, what is the legitimacy of gender roles? And because this came up a few times, like Winters, in her ideal society, she said explicitly she'd want everyone to be androgynous, be roughly indistinguishable, whereas distributed, and I think pretty much everyone here would hold the view that the genders are, they have a roughly fixed nature and they serve a complementary purpose. And I think Dave explicitly said this. He said that in his ideal world, there would be a complementarity between the genders. But again, this is it's a question which undergird this whole discussion, and it kind of makes them talk at cross purposes if it's not discussed.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Anarcho, do you have anything you want to add to this?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So I think when it comes down to, I mean, there's two ways you can look at this debate. Let me give you an analogy. If you look at the Korean War and we ask who won and who lost, it depends on how you consider the victory. Initially, the terms were expel the North Koreans from everywhere south of the 30th parallel, which we did, which according to the original mandate would be considered a victory. But then once we defeated the North Koreans after Incheon, and MacArthur persuaded the UN forces and the Joint Chiefs of Staff to try to unite the Korean Peninsula, we drove almost to the Yalu. And then we were subsequently rolled back south of Seoul. And then we fought around the 38th parallel for the remaining 2 years of the war. Now, when we then signed a armistice with the North Koreans, you could see that as either a defeat or a tie. It's a defeat in the sense that we failed to unite Korea, and it's a tie in the sense that we signed an armistice as equals with somebody else, which I think, to my mind, is the first time America has ever signed an armistice with anybody, treating them as an equal. It was an armistice with Germany in 1918, but they were clearly defeated. In the case in Korea, it was between equals. And so depending on how you evaluate the war, it could either be a defeat, a victory, or a tie. I think the same goes for debates. If we look at this debate as a mustering the facts to make to prove this one point, this consequentialist point, that the sex revolution leads to a lot of bad outcomes that even feminists would not be happy with. Yeah, I think he provided the evidence more than adequately. But as Dave is always fond of telling the group, the Clairtrads group, it's about optics. Now, optically, I think Kristi won, and here's why. Because when Dave implicitly adopted feminist values implicitly, when he said, we need to work together with feminists, I wish second-wave feminism had worked better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's basically conceding the legitimacy of second-wave feminism. So at the end of the day, it's an in-house debate between two, quote, feminists, whether that was the intention Dave wanted to send or not. That's what he said. So at the end of the day, feminism itself is not actually challenged. What's being challenged is the implementation of a certain strand of feminism. And I don't think that that's the kind of outcome that as traditionalists we would have liked to have seen. We would have liked to have seen feminism as a whole being challenged effectively. And so in that sense, I don't think at the end of the day, when you walk away from the debate, you can say that feminism was seriously challenged. What was challenged was an implementation of one wave of feminism. And I don't think that that's quite what we had expected or wanted. So Matt, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple ways you can look at this debate. If you are basically somebody who's just roughly speaking anti-social justice and maybe just even a secular liberal type, this debate was probably a win for you, because what you have is you have a secular consequentialist view of the statistics, which challenges the academic narrative. I mean, Kristi Winters is a doctor, and this did, because Dave didn't really go into his academic background, really did look like a David and Goliath situation from one perspective. And at the end of it, Dave's statistics could be, seem to be left standing. And so what you have is you have these two systems. Some of the skeptic community, Noel Plum especially, vouched for Dave to distribute Kristi. And so I don't think I don't think that they would have been unhappy with the result of the debate. Traditionalists, I could see them being very unhappy with the debate because of how much metaphysical ground was just conceded. It was argued basically on the realm of secular ground. And the third way, as Todd pointed to before, just the facts. I want to say that Dave won it, but I think he needed to be stronger. I think for his statistics, he would have done a much better job cementing it in the audience if he provided long-term regression analyses to provide a longer trend discussion of the statistics. That way, when Kristi says, oh, well, such and such increased, it's like, okay, yeah, but how much did it increase relative to the decrease? As a member of the audience, I don't have the graph on hand to look at. So having, a rough regression line to look at and say, blip or no blip, here's what it's doing, I think that would have helped him out a lot.
Yeah. Snake, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I remembered what I was getting at earlier, which is Dave really should have kind of attempted to break the narrative that she was establishing. So, for example, he could have really, pinned her down and forced her to address the topic of single motherhood. And I think he was getting at that, but, he should have asked her outright, like, do you think that single motherhood is a good thing or a bad thing? If she had said out loud during the debate that it's a bad thing, I think that would have really disrupted some of her audience, because I'm sure she has a lot of people who would be appalled at that notion. And furthermore, we were talking about how he conceded a lot of ground to kind of the feminist ideology. And it can be useful to concede some ground to kind of pick your battles, but I feel like he didn't get much in return for the concessions he made, so ultimately it wasn't really worth it. I guess the final thing I would say is, obviously, he probably did better than Sargon. There's going to be different opinions. Think of it like kind of an election. There's going to be hardcore people on both sides who've made up their minds before the debate even started. But there will be some people who are kind of in the middle trying to figure out, who did a better job of defending their position. And I don't think those people would have been won over. And in that sense, I would say maybe Kristi didn't do a great job, but Dave didn't do his best, I think, or he didn't do as well as he could have given the circumstances he was in.
Yeah. Mathoma, I hear that you have something you want to add.
Yeah, there was one thing I think the distributors could have gotten Winters on. He could have exploited her a little bit more. And I think it's mainly due because Winters is very confused on what she believes, I think. She says that what she conceives of as the good is human flourishing. And then I actually asked her this question in the Q&A, what she means by flourishing, and she brought up eudaimonia, which, at least to my mind, brings back something like virtue ethics, let's say, of the Aristotelian sort. And I think she could have been pressed on that a little bit more, because if she's serious about with this virtue ethics, this commits her to a lot of things besides bodily autonomy, as she apparently thinks is the greatest good, the summum bonum. And I think it also commits her to things like a fixed nature between the genders. I think she could have been exploited on that. What I think she means by human flourishing, she should have said more clearly, what is liberal values. That's really what she values, not eudaimonia in the classical Greek sense. I think the distributors could have gotten her on that point.
Yeah, I think you're probably correct on that. But I think that at the end of the day, the feminist narrative wasn't actually challenged. What was challenged, I believe, is a implementation of a wave of feminism. Now, Matt, you have some thoughts about the lessons that were learned after the debate, primarily dealing with metaphysics. Did you want to talk about that any?
I think I've touched on it throughout the discussion. All I wanted to say on that, I can't think of anything else I wanted to add unless there was something else you were looking for specifically. No,
if you're good on that. So I guess unless there's anything else anybody wants to add, we'll wrap this up.
I mean, just to make a closing statement, I remember Dave said in one of the I think the last I forget which one, he said, if you're playing not to lose, you can still lose, but you can't win. And I was reminded of that to an extent in this debate. Well, even though I don't think Dave lost because he was playing a lot of the time not to lose, he could never really drive home the point he was making. So that's just my last words on the subject.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.